Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today, we are here with another very interesting guest speaker with another very interesting topic. Today's topic is episode 17, Big Brothers and the Economics, Part 5. Suharto, Franco, and Stalin with Mr. Arjun Mukherjee. Arjun Mukherjee is a rising senior at Princeton High School in the US. He's a very talented student who is very much interested in the fields of economics and politics, and we are very glad to have him here with us today. Mr. Arjun Mukherjee actually spent a lot of his time near Suharto's country, Indonesia, in Singapore. So his insights on this topic and matter would be greatly appreciated. And thank you, Mr. Arjun Mukherjee, for coming into our podcast discussion today. Is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
Yeah, no, it's great to being here, and I love to share my insights on economics. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Arjun Mukherjee, for the introduction and for being a guest speaker in today's episode. Again, today's episode is episode 17, Big Brothers and the Economists, Suharto, Franco, and Stalin with Mr. Arjun Mukherjee. Let's get into our discussion today. So, first of all, let's talk about Suharto and a little bit about his background. So, he was born on June 8, 1921 in Kemusuk, which is a small village near Yogyakarta, Central Java, and what was then known as Dutch East Indies, and now it's known as Indonesia. Suharto was the only child of a peasant family, and his parents divorced shortly after his birth, and he was raised by various relatives, including his grandparents, who played a significant role in his upbringing. And he joined the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, KINL, in 1940 and trained as a soldier. And after the Japanese occupation of Indonesia in 1942, he joined the Japanese-sponsored militia PETA, which was basically known as Defenders of the Homeland, and PETA is an acronym for Defenders of the Homeland. And he also played a significant role in the Indonesian National Revolution, which happened between 1945 and 1949 against Dutch colonial rule, and he rose through the ranks of the newly formed Indonesian army. And in the 1960s, he was appointed as the commander of the Diponegoro division in Central Java, and he became involved heavily in suppressing regional rebellions, which bolstered his military reputation. And he was known for being a very strict and a very strict military commander, and he easily was able to control many of the rebellions that happened in Indonesia under his rule as commander of the Diponegoro division in Central Java. And following an attempted coup in 1965 led by the 30 September movement G30S, Suharto assumed control of the army and effectively quelled the uprising, and the uprising that followed afterwards, which wanted him to be kicked out of office. But he successfully quelled the uprising, and he became the president of Indonesia. And he gradually took power from President Sukarno, who was the first president of Indonesia. And Sukarno was the first president, and Suharto came afterwards. And those names sound very similar, but they're very different people. And using the political turmoil after the coup as justification, and he officially became the president of Indonesia in March 1968, marking the beginning of the New Order regime. That was what it was called, his regime, New Order regime. And he ruled Indonesia with iron fist from 1968 to 1998, which almost 30 years, focusing on economic development, political stability, and anti-communism. And it's very important, this word, anti-communism. His very anti-communist style of rule was what the US liked about him so much, that they supported him and his rule in Indonesia, and also the numerous human rights allegations that he had committed. He killed a lot of communists in Indonesia, and with the support of the US, because it was during the Cold War. And he implemented policies that attracted foreign investment and promoted economic growth, leading to the rapid industrialization of Indonesia. And his government was marked by a very strong central authority, suppression of political opposition, and widespread corruption. And Suharto's regime was notorious for human rights abuses, including the suppression of dissent, censorship, and the imprisonment and execution of political opponents. And he was involved in military operations in East Timor, Papua, and Aceh, where alleged human rights violations occurred, and he saw significant economic growth with annual GDP growth rates averaging over 77% during the 1980s, and he established a number of state-owned enterprises and promoted agricultural self-sufficiency, notably in rice production. And the Asian financial crisis of 1997-1998 severely affected Indonesia's economy, leading to widespread protests and demands for political reform. And during this growing unrest, Suharto resigned on May 21, 1998, ending his 31-year presidency. And post presidency, he lived in relative seclusion after his resignation, and he faced numerous legal charges related to corruption and human rights abuses, but never stood trial due to health reasons. And he passed away on January 27, 2008, in Jakarta, Indonesia, after suffering multiple organ failures. And Suharto's legacy is controversial. He is credited with transforming Indonesia's economy but criticized for authoritarian rule and human rights violation. And the period of his rule is referred to as the New Order era, characterized by political and economic stability, but also due to its high rate of corruption and nepotism. So this is a very brief introduction about Suharto's life and his time as Indonesian president. So are there any more information, or are there any opinions that you would like to add? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or Arjun Mukherjee?
Yeah, I think it's also like important to highlight just how much he diversified the economy following the decrease in oil prices. He really shifted his investments, and I think that really helped to stabilize the economy, and also increase economic growth, and it also reduced the hyperinflation that was happening in the country.
Yeah, and also to add on to what you guys said, I can also talk a bit about his economic policies, which Suharto's New Order regime was characterized by a focus on economic stabilization and growth, and his policies were heavily influenced by Western economic models, and he sought the assistance of international organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. And the key aspects of his economic approach was, first of all, stabilization and reform. And when Suharto took power, Indonesia was in economic turmoil with high inflation and significant debt. And his administration implemented measures to stabilize the economy, including cutting government subsidies, improving fiscal discipline, and securing foreign aid. And these steps helped bring inflation under control and restore confidence in the Indonesian economy. And also, attracting foreign investment. Suharto's regime was keen on attracting foreign investment, particularly in the oil and gas sectors, which were critical to the country's economy. And to facilitate this, the government provided incentives for foreign companies and streamlined the process for establishing operations in Indonesia.
Yeah, I would also like to talk about the fact that I think Arjun and Shazib were talking about. It's like Suharto was definitely a controversial leader, and like he had his ups and downs. But like during the New Order period of Suharto from 67 to 98, Indonesia actually, like statistically speaking, like the GDP growth was around 7% during Suharto's regime, which positioned the Indonesia as one of the fastest growing economies in the world during that period. And in 1967, Indonesia's GDP per capita was like around $100, but during the mid 90s, before Suharto resigned, this figure had risen to over $1,000, 10, which is 10x the value, and this reflected the substantial improvements in the standard of living for many Indonesians. And not only that, like the foreign direct investment, the FDI during Suharto's government also like increased a lot, from like $50 million in 1967 to $6 billion in 1996. So 1996. So this shows that these capital inflows from abroad helped finance the economy, and since the capital inflow is part of the and since capital inflow is part of the savings, it also shows that the economy was diversified. And also, like Suharto's policies were
there were some social policies as well, like the poverty rates fell from 60% in the 1960s and 70s to around 15%. So yeah, those were the pros, but definitely there were some cons as well, such as like many people say that Suharto's regime was primarily based out of crony capitalism. So his regime was deeply flawed, and only his like inner circle people actually benefited. And like this is proven by the fact that during the Asian financial crisis in 1997 to 1998, like the rupiah, which is the Indonesian currency, lost 80% of its value, and the GDP contracted by 13.1%. So it shows that when Suharto's regime fell and his cronies actually left with him, the economy suffered as well during the Asian financial crisis. So that's for my part.
Thank you, Arif, for sharing your opinions and for talking about a little bit about economy of Indonesia under Suharto. And Suharto shifted from Sukarno's guided democracy principle and economic chaos to a more market-oriented approach. And his regime focused on stabilizing the economy and reducing hyperinflation, which had reached over 600% by 1966. So Suharto reduced it from 600% to a relatively stable amount, which was around like 6-7%. And he introduced new order policies aimed at economic stabilization and growth. And Suharto's government collaborated with Western economies and institutions like the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and World Bank for economic restructuring. And he opened the economy to foreign direct investment, attracting multinational corporations in sectors like oil, mining, and manufacturing. And his policies encouraged joint ventures between Indonesian companies and foreign firms. And he emphasized industrialization as a path to economic development, shifting from agriculture to manufacturing. And there was also a lot of development of infrastructure such as roads, ports, and telecommunications, which supported industrial growth. And the economy also benefited from the oil boom of the 1970s, with oil and gas becoming major revenue source for the government. And oil revenues were also used to finance public investment in infrastructure and social services. He also implemented the green revolution in agriculture, introducing high yield rice varieties and modern farming techniques, which helped achieve self sufficiency in rice production by the mid 1980s. And he also had a lot of economic growth, which contributed to significant poverty reduction and improved living standard. And there was also a lot of investment in education and healthcare, which improved literacy rates and reduced infant mortality. And Suharto also had a lot of state-owned enterprises (SOEs), which he expanded in the economy with key sectors under state control, including energy, transportation, and banking. And SOEs were also characterized for inefficiency and corruption. And the economy, unfortunately, was also marred by widespread corruption and nepotism, with Suharto's family and associates benefiting from lucrative business deals. And his regime, his regime was famous for the tree for KKN, in Indonesia, in the Indonesian language. KKN is the well, it stands for corrupsi, colusi, and nepotisme, and which basically means corruption, collusion between the governments and the politicians and the businessmen, and nepotism, which happened in Suharto's regime. And there were also a lot of efforts which were made to diversify the economy beyond oil, promoting manufacturing and exports of textiles, electronics, and footwear. And the export-oriented policies led to increased trade and foreign exchange earnings. During the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998, the crisis exposed structural weakness in the economy, including over-reliance on short-term foreign debt and a fragile banking sector. And the Indonesian economy, which was the rupiah, collapsed, leading to inflation, unemployment, and social unrest. And the impact of the economic crisis was that there was a lot of economic contraction, and the poverty increased significantly, with millions falling below the poverty line. And this crisis was what ultimately led to Suharto's resignation in 1998. And as for the legacy and impact of Suharto's regime, Suharto's economic policies credited with transforming Indonesia from a struggling economy to one of the largest in Southeast Asia and most dynamic economies. The era left a complex legacy, balancing impressive economic achievements with deep-seated corruption and inequality. And obviously, Suharto's regime in Indonesia cannot be describe in one word, obviously it was very instrumental for Indonesia's economic growth, because under Suharto there was a lot of economic growth, and there was a lot of things that happened, good things that happened on economically, but there was also a lot of human rights violation and a lot of things like that. So, which was also very unfortunate. And Suharto's economic policies obviously laid the foundation for Indonesia's modern economic landscape, with both positive and negative long-term effects. And Suharto, even though Suharto was the president of Indonesia until 1998, me and Arif met Suharto's son, and the Suharto's youngest son, Tommy Suharto, and he's also known as Hutumu Mandala Putra, but he's known as commonly as Tommy Suharto in Kuala Lumpur, in an area called Bukit Bintang, which is a good area, and in a hotel actually. And we talked to him. We talked to with him for like an hour or so, and he's a very colorful guy, Tommy Suharto. If you Google him, you'll see he's a very interesting person. But according to him, his father, obviously there was corruption, but there's corruption in every there has been corruption in every sector in Indonesia, and there's been corruption in every president's regime. But Suharto's era led to a lot of economic growth, which is ultimately good for Indonesia, and that was his perspective. So this is a lot of information and opinion that I shared. But are there any information opinions that you would like to share? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or Arjun Mukherjee?
Yeah, I think you guys summed up all of the points very well. But yeah, just to, I guess, sum everything up, like, I think Suharto's policies were very good at short term, but long term, it revealed many flaws that still perpetuate today, which is especially like a fragile financial system. And there's also like a lack of institutional transparency. So a lot of these like structural weaknesses are still perpetuated today.
Yeah, and to add on to you guys, as Araf, you're talking about Suharto's economic policies led to significant economic growth, like, and particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, as Indonesia's GDP grew at an average annual rate of 7% during that period, and the country made substantial progress in reducing poverty. However, the new order's economic success came with serious drawbacks, as you guys had mentioned, and these drawbacks were the corruption, as Araf, you were also talking about it, as Suharto's regime was marked by widespread corruption, and his family and close associates amassed vast wealth by monopolizing key industries and engaging in rent-seeking behavior. And this led to economic inefficiencies and growing public discontent over time. And also the economic inequality. While Indonesia as a whole benefited from economic growth, the gains were not evenly distributed. Regional disparities persisted, with wealth concentrated in Java and urban areas, and this inequality fueled social unrest, particularly during periods of economic downturn. And also the economic crisis and downfall. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998 exposed the vulnerabilities of Indonesia's economy, which had been heavily reliant on short-term foreign capital, as Arjun had mentioned. And the crisis led to severe economic downturn, a sharp depreciation of the rupiah, and social unrest. And Suharto's inability to manage the crisis ultimately led to his resignation in May 1998, marking the end of the New Order regime.
I would say like I agree with Arjun and Shazib, but like economic wise, I agree that short term wise it was beneficial because it boosted the economy, but long term wise it wasn't sustainable enough. But I would like to like talk about some of the social factors, like during Suharto's regime. It was also known as one of the darkest episodes of Indonesian politics, because around 500,000 to 1 million, the number isn't really specific, but like about more than 500,000 people were killed in the anti-communist purges, and the survivors often faced long-term persecution. And the regime security forces were also responsible for the widespread human rights violation in like regions such as East Timor, Aceh, and like Papua, where separatist movements were met with brutal military oppressions. repressions, and it shows that Suharto's regime profoundly shaped Indonesia's landscape in terms of the social inequality and the human rights. And like Indonesia is also relatively close to Singapore, and like in one of the previous Big Brothers episodes, we were also talking about Lee Kuan Yew and like how his policies also like improved Singapore's economy, but they were also controversial because of Singapore's some of the Singapore's policies, which might be somewhat deemed as a violation of human rights, because like protesting and like other such things are not really allowed for national security. So since Arjun is from Singapore and he has lived in Singapore all his life, I would like to say, like, Arjun, would you say like Indonesia and Singapore, like Suharto's regime and like Singapore's regime are similar in a way, because economically, because not economically but socially speaking, would you say like Singapore and Indonesia are similar, or would you say like it's different?
I would say after these discussions, I would say it's very similar, especially because, as you mentioned, the lack of protest, really just the lack of freedom of speech, um, and also, yeah, just a very tight socialist capitalist kind of system where a lot of things are centrally controlled and centrally planned, along with the government. And I think one important thing to highlight is that, at least in Singapore's case, it was also very similar to Indonesia, where it had a very slow start, but due to like very good economic policies, it faced like very steady growth. Um, Even to this day, I think a lot of that has helped with its location, being in like the perfect spot in Asia where it is a nice hub for trading. But I think the policies that we see in Indonesia are also very similar in Singapore, and they have significantly helped the economy for economic growth.
You have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything more?
Yeah, like I agree with Arjun, because personally, me, Araf, and like Shazim, we have been to Singapore multiple times, and like we go there like at least once a year for checkup. And I would say like, yeah, like Singapore, like there is like I wouldn't say there is social inequality, but I would say like there is some lack of freedom of speech. But but I would also say like economically speaking, it's better than Indonesia, because Indonesia's policies were not sustainable for the long term. But like Singapore, like Arjun mentioned, like he lived in Singapore for like almost majority of his life. Like he was saying like Singapore, like it's like quite developed. So I wouldn't, so like Arjun, like I would say you're Singaporean. So would you say like the social inequality and lack of freedom of speech, like do Singaporeans really care about it, or do Singaporeans really care about it? Because they're like Singaporeans are actually very well off, well off, and like they have like they have like healthcare, education, which are basically free. So would you say like those stuff make up for the lack of social inequality, lack of freedom of speech?
Yeah, I think a lot of the social welfare programs, and alongside that, the low income taxes, the low property taxes, also very good retirement plans in Singapore help to offset this kind of um, this freedom of speech problem that we see in Singapore. But there's also a lot of state suppression. So whenever there have been cases of, for example, I remember there was a case about gay marriage in Singapore, and there's a lot of upset about that. But the state immediately suppressed this freedom of speech, and so I think people over time have gotten used to this, just having a lack of freedom of speech, and it's also embedded in the culture where it's not very normal to talk against the government or talk against things. It's similar to China. It's not seen as a social norm.
Shazim, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Oh yeah, maybe. Arif, I think I can also add some information to your question, as you had already mentioned that we visit Singapore often, and I was also born in Singapore. So to add some information to your question that you asked, Ari, I'd say that Singapore has long been known for its remarkable economic success and social order under the leadership of the PAP, particularly during Lee Kuan Yew's tenure. And the country prioritized economic development and social harmony, often at the expense of certain civil liberties, including freedom of speech. And this trade off has been largely accepted by the population because of the tangible benefits it's brought, such as a high standard of living, low crime rates, and efficient governance. So I'd say because because of this success and the advantages that the Singaporeans get as being a citizen in the country, that's why I think they're fine with not fine with the lack of freedom of speech. And yeah, I'd say that's my opinion of it.
Thank you, Shazib, for sharing your opinions, and thank you also, Arif Malik and Arjun Mukherjee, for sharing your opinions. Now, let's move on to our second big brother, which is Mr. Franco, Francisco Franco, and he was born in December 4, 1892, in Ferrol, Galicia, Spain, and he came from a naval family, and his father was a naval officer, and he attended the infantry academy in Toledo, graduating in 1910, and he began his military career in Morocco, fighting the Rif War against Berber tribes, and he quickly rose to the ranks due to his leadership skills and bravery, becoming Spain's youngest general in 1926, and he gained a reputation as a disciplined and effective military officer. And during the 1920s and 1930s in Spain, which were marked by political instability with frequent changes in government and growing tensions between leftist and rightist faction, Franco was initially loyal to the Spanish monarchy and later to the Republic, but his conservative and nationalist views aligned with more the right-wing politics. And in 1936, Franco led a military coup against the Spanish Republican government, which marked the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, which lasted between 1936 and 1939. And he became the leader of the nationalist forces, receiving support from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And his forces defeated the Republicans, establishing a dictatorship in Spain, and he declared himself a caudillo, which means leader of Spain, ruling from 1939 until his death in 1975. And he established an authoritarian regime characterized by political repression, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. And Franco's state was supported by a coalition of conservatives, monarchists, and the Catholic Church. And he initially implemented autarkic, self-sufficient economic policies, leading to economic stagnation and hardship. And in the 1950s, he shifted to a more open and market-oriented economy, resulting in significant economic growth known as the Spanish Miracle. And his regime was marked by brutal repression of political opponents, including executions, imprisonments, and forced labor camps. And he suppressed regional identities and languages, particularly targeting Catalonia and the Basque County. He maintained neutrality during World War II, but sympathized with the Axis powers, which was Nazi Germany and Italy. And during post-war, he was isolated by the international community due to his fascist ties, but gained strategic importance during a Cold War. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Franco faced increasing pressure for political reform and modernization, and he named Prince Juan Carlos as his successor, paving the way for the restoration of the Spanish monarchy. And he died on November 20, 1975, after a prolonged sickness. And his death marked the end of his dictatorship and the beginning of the Spanish transition to democracy, which is known globally as the Spanish transition. And his legacy remains controversial, with debates over his role in Spanish history and the impact of his rule on Spain's development. And his regime has left deep scars in Spanish society, influencing politics, culture, and regional tensions for decades. And Franco's rule left a lasting impact on Spain, shaping its political landscape and influencing its transition to economy. So this is a very brief introduction of Franco. Are there any opinions or information that you would like to add, Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or Arjun Mukherjee?
I think, like, specifically the autarkic phase of Franco's rule was quite harsh, and I think what we see is that it led to a lot of economic stagnation, led to a lot of hardship, and also socially it led to a lot of inequality and wealth gaps. But the later shift towards the liberalization is where we really see a lot of these significant growth factors. We see less social inequality. We see more modernization. We see a lot of more international trade, which I think is an example of how globalization is just the number one way to increase economic growth and to really expand an economy's production possibilities.
Yeah, and to add on to you guys and talk more about Franco, I'd like to talk about Franco's economic policies. So, Franco's economic policies can be divided into two distinct phases, I'd say. The autarkic period and the period of economic liberalization. And the autarky was in 1939 to 1959, and we can talk about the state control, as the government imposed heavy controls on the economy, including price controls, rationing, and state monopolies over key industries such as oil, steel, and telecommunications. And also, we can look at the economic stagnation, as the policy of autarky was largely a failure, and it led to severe economic stagnation, food shortages, and black markets, and a significant decline in living standards. And Spain lagged behind its Western European neighbors in terms of industrialization and economic development during this period. And if we look at the economic liberalization, which was known as the Spanish miracle, as Araf had stated, from 1959 till the 1975, this was so we can first look at the shift to liberalization, as by the late 1950s it became clear that autarky was unsustainable, and in 1959, under pressure from technocrats within the regime and international financial institutions, Spain adopted the stabilization plan de Stabilización, marking a significant shift towards economic liberalization. And we can also talk about the industrial growth. The regime promoted industrialization through its investment in infrastructure, including roads, ports, and energy. And foreign companies were encouraged to set up manufacturing operations in Spain, leading to rapid industrialization growth. And finally, the economic growth. This period of rapid economic growth, often referred to as the Spanish miracle, saw Spain's GDP grow at an average annual rate of over 7%, and the country transitioned from a largely agrarian economy to a more industrialized and urbanized society.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib here, and I would say like like Francisco Franco really needed to learn some basic economics before trying to manage Spain, because autarky, like I remember when I was with Arjun at Yale, and our professor Dalton was saying that countries with autarky like North Korea are actually the dumbest countries, because autarky actually prevents the production possibilities curve from expanding, like Arjun was mentioning. And I would say like Franco's rule was irrevocably the worst economic period for Spain, because in the immediate aftermath of the civil war, the autarky that Franco implemented was aimed for economic self-sufficiency, but this actually was not ideal, because self-sufficiency is not ideal because it limits the production possibilities curve, and as a result the GDP grew very slowly at just 1% annually, below the levels needed for the post Civil War reconstruction. And because of this, the unemployment and inflation were rampant, and inflation was, I believe, above 20% in the late 1940s. So I would say, yeah, like Spain suffered a lot of inflation, but I wouldn't say it was as bad as the German Deutschmark, but it was still pretty bad because of the autarkic policies, which could have been saved. But I would say the fact that Shazib was saying the Shazib mentioned the Spanish miracle in the 60s and 70s, and I would say I would say the plan, which was guided by the technocrats, aimed to open Spain's economy to foreign investment and trade, and we can clearly see that without autarky, Spain's Spanish miracle actually occurred, and the GDP output grew massively, and massively as a result of this. So with that being said, I would like to like ask Arjun a question here. So like Arjun, like considering the economic stabilization under Franco's rule, albeit at the cost of the severe political repression, how do you think the balance between the economic growth and the political freedom is viewed differently in Spain compared to countries like Singapore and the United States, both countries that you have lived in? Like, how have like historical experiences shaped the way that these countries prioritize economic policies in relation to the civil liberties today? Would you say the Singapore and United States are different economically speaking and like politically speaking?
Yeah, so I think economically speaking, this Singapore and United States share a lot of similarities. Um, there's definitely a heavily lean in capitalism and investment. There's very little government involvement in terms of business ventures. Um, of course, in the United States, it's relatively easier to open up business. There's more property rights. You have more individual freedoms as a person than in Singapore, which leads to the social discussion, where I think in the United States, obviously in the Constitution, these social rights are kind of embedded into the legal system, into the constitution. Whereas in Singapore, none of these things are clearly defined, and it's very much up to the government to decide what is allowed and what is not allowed, which I think has led to a lot of issues regarding, um, just basic human rights and also just personal freedoms. So I think politically speaking, they're very different. Um, and I honestly, after living in both countries, I definitely prefer the United States system because I think it gives more individual power to the person rather than as a collective whole. And I think this system that the United States has is also much stronger, and it promotes more economic growth as a person, as you're more willing to involve yourself in the economy.
Thank you for sharing all the opinions and talking a little bit about Franco's economy, and some of you have highlighted a little bit information also about him. So during his early economic policies, which was between 1939 and 1950s, he had to face a lot of autarky and isolation. And Franco's regime initially pursued autarkic policies aimed at economic sufficiency. He limited foreign trade and investment, relying on state control and regulation of the economy, and he focused on promoting domestic industries, which led to inefficiencies and stagnation. And Spain faced severe economic difficulties in the immediate post-war years, including food shortages, high inflation, and unemployment. And the country was economically isolated from much of Europe, struggling with a lack of resources and technological advancement. And by the early 1950s, international pressure and economic necessities prompted the regime to reconsider its policies. And Spain's strategic importance during the Cold War led to increased foreign aid and investment, particularly from the United States. And there was also a lot of liberation efforts. The government implemented the Spanish economic reforms in 1950s and 1960s. The Stabilization Plan of 1959 aimed to address economic imbalances and promote growth through liberalization and modernization. And the 1960s saw significant economic growth, with annual GDP growth rates averaging around 70% during the Spanish miracle. And industrialization accelerated, and Spain began to attract foreign investment, particularly in manufacturing and tourism. And major investments were made in infrastructure, including highways, airports, and urban development, which facilitated economic expansion. And the tourism became a major industry, with Spain emerging as a popular destination and international tourists. And economic development was obviously uneven, with significant disparities between industrialized regions like Catalonia and the Basque counties, and less developed areas in southern Spain. And the region's popularity favored certain areas, exaggerating regional inequalities. And despite economic growth, labor conditions were also poor, with limited workers' rights and low wages. The regime suppressed labor strikes and dissent, maintaining strict control over trade unions and labor movements. And the 1970s oil crisis led to economic difficulties, including rising inflation and increased import costs. And the Spanish economy faced stagnation and growing fiscal deficit, compounded by global economic challenges. And the economic issues contributed to social unrest and dissatisfaction with Franco's regime. And the transition to democracy in the mid 1970s brought about significant economic changes, including reforms and integration into the European Economic Community (EEC). And Franco's later economic policies laid the groundwork for Spain's modernization and integration in the global economy. And the period of economic growth in the 1960s and early 1970s helped Spain transform from an isolated agrarian economy to an industrialized nation. And the region's economic policies were marked by a mix of successes and failures, with significant achievements in its growth and modernization, but also notable inequality and repression. And Franco's economic policies had a profound impact on Spain, shaping its development and positioning it for future growth, while leaving a legacy of both achievement and controversies, particularly his involvement with the Nazis and with fascist Italy. So this is another big piece of information about Spain's economy under Franco. Are there any opinions or any more information that you would like to add? Arif Malik, Joseph Karim, or Arjun Mukherjee?
I think also following the liberalization, tourism also rapidly grew in the country, which I think was another major factor in bringing more government revenue in the form of just tourist expenditures, and I think that really significantly helped their capital inflow. Um, as Spain is also one of the most traveled countries in the world, so I think that's a significant factor contributing to economic growth.
So I'd say that Franco's legacy is deeply contested in Spain, and on the one hand, his economic policies in the latter part of his rule helped modernize the country and improve living standards for many Spaniards, and on the other hand, his regime was marked by authoritarianism, repression, and a disregard for human rights. And the economic growth during Franco's later years often overshadows the severe hardships of the autarkic period. And however, the transition to democracy after Franco's death was made smoother by the economic progress achieved under his rule, albeit at a significant social and political cost. Um, and if there, and I'd say that since we already discussed all this, I had a question to ask you guys, and wanted to see your opinion on it. That's it. So my question to you guys is, in what ways did the economic policies of Franco's regime lay the groundwork for Spain's post-Franco transition to democracy?
Arif, you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I would like to answer Shazib's question, but before that, I would actually like to talk about the fact that Francisco Franco, like, just to clear out the air, like, Francisco Franco is someone that is not celebrated by the Spaniards anymore. Like, this was one of the questions that I had received from one of our viewers before the podcast. So, like, in 2007, I would like to talk about a policy, which was the law of law of historical memory, which in Spanish is called Ley de Memoria Histórica, and this formally condemned Franco's regime and sought to remove the symbols of Francoism from the public spaces. And law also provided support for the families of Franco's victims, uh, including the exhumation of mass graves from the Civil War era. And as a part of this effort, in 2019, Franco's remains were exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen, which in Spanish is known as the Valle de los Caídos, and relocated to a more discreet location, possibly being burned or thrown out in the Atlantic Ocean, who knows. And this clearly signals that the Spanish government does not want to glorify Franco's legacy. And the question that Shazib asked, like, the economic framework that shaped Spain's post-Franco economy transition, I would say it is a very interesting question, because there's not really one single answer there. But I would say one of the crucial economic reforms was the Stabilization Plan of 1959, which marked a significant shift from autarky to the economic liberalization. So, like, this plan, as mentioned before, was designed by the technocrats and was influenced by the Opus Dei. And this aimed to transition Spanish economy from autarky, which means they won't trade with other foreign countries, to economic liberalization, which means they're open and they're free and they want to trade with other countries. So I would say this transition is mainly the reason, this transition is mainly the economic framework that shaped Spain's post-Franco economy and helped to modernize the modernize Spain. And I would say later on, after like 30 40 years, the integration into the European Union also played a significant part, because after joining the EU, the Spanish currency, which was already pretty weak, the Spanish peso compared to other European countries, were ditched, and Spain followed the euro currency. And as a result of following a currency that many other European countries follow, the post-Franco economic framework in Spain was also characterized by more economic growth, because as a result of joining the European Union, Spain also experienced significant economic growth. Like, yeah, that I hope that answers Shazib's question. If Arjun or Araf, if you want to chime in as well.
Yeah, thank you for answering that.
Thank you for all the information, all the opinions that were added. Now let's move on to our third big brother for today, which is third and final big brother for today, which is Stalin. And actually, Stalin was born in Isop Bessariones desde Huga Civili on December 8, 1878 in Gori, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. And he grew up in a very poor family. His father was a cobbler and his mother was a washerwoman. And he attended a seminary in Tbilisi where he developed Marxist ideas and became involved with revolutionary politics. Uh, and he joined the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party led by Vladimir Putin. And he was arrested and exiled to Siberia multiple times for his revolutionary activities. And he played a key role in the October Revolution of 1917, which led to the Bolsheviks seizing power. And he became a prominent member of the Communist Party, holding various positions, including General Secretary from 1922. And after Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin maneuvered to consolidate his power, outmaneuvering and eliminating political rivals like Leon Trotsky. And by the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin established a totalitarian regime with himself at the center of power. And he implemented the forced collectivization of agriculture, consolidating individual farms into the state-run collectives. And this led to widespread famine and suffering, particularly in Ukraine, which was known as the Holodomor. And he launched a series of 5 year plans aimed at rapid industrialization and modernization of the Soviet Union. This resulted in significant economic growth, but often involved harsh labor conditions, state control. And he conducted the Great Purge, which happened between 1936 and 1938, which was a campaign of political repression that involved widespread purges of the Communist Party, military, and intelligentsia. And many were executed or imprisoned in labor camps, which were known as gulags. And he developed a cult of personality on himself, controlling media and propaganda to maintain his image and authority. And he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, a non-regression pact that included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. And after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 through the Operation Barbarossa, Stalin led the Soviet Union in the fight against Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union played a crucial role in the defeat of Nazi Germany with significant battles like Stalingrad. And after World War II, Stalin oversaw the expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, establishing communist regimes in several countries. And his policies and action contributed to the onset of the Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and Western powers. And he died on March 5, 1953, from a stroke. And his rule left a complex legacy characterized by rapid industrialization and victory in World War II, but also marked by severe repression, widespread purges, and human rights abuses. And his policies had a profound impact on the Soviet Union and its role in global politics. And Stalin's life and rule had a significant impact on the 20th century, shaping Soviet Union and global history through his policies, leadership style, and the political climate of his era. So this is a very brief introduction about Stalin's life history. So are there any opinions or any more information that you would like to add? Malik, Arjun, Mukherjee, or Shazib Karim?
Yeah, sure. I can add and talk about his economic policies. So Stalin's economic policies were driven by his vision of transforming the Soviet Union from a predominantly agrarian society into an industrial superpower, and his approach was marked by centralized planning, state control of the economy, and a disregard for the human costs of his policies. And the key aspects of his economic strategy would first of all be the collectivization of agriculture from 1928 to the 1940s, and his goal was to consolidate so Stalin sought to consolidate individual peasant farms into large state-controlled collective farms and state farms, and the aim was to increase agricultural productivity and to extract surplus grain to fund industrialization. And the implementation of this was that the policy was implemented with brutal force, leading to the seizure of land, livestock, and grain from peasants. And wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, were targeted and often deported, imprisoned, or even executed. And the consequences of this was that collectivization led to widespread resistance among peasants, resulting in severe disruptions to agricultural production, and the most tragic consequence was the famine of 1932 to 1933, known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, which resulted in the deaths of millions of people.
Yeah, I also just want to add, talk about his policies regarding production. So I think like while we were at Yale, me and Arab, uh, we were at Yale. Dalton was talking about the Soviet Union quite a lot and a lot of the issues with it. And one of them was Stalin's harsh policies and quotas regarding the production of manufactured goods. He would often impose quotas that were pretty unrealistic and really hard to meet, and that would often it would lead to basically people undercutting the amount of production or people lying about the amount that they produced, and also just producing goods that were of poor quality. So essentially, what would happen is that Soviet produced goods were quite inferior to the Western world, and it led to a lot of problems down the line with, as we see today, a lot of their military equipment has started malfunctioning, and a lot of their goods have become obsolete due to bad manufacturing practices.
Yeah, I would agree with Arjun and Shazib here. Like, yeah, Arjun was talking about our time at Yale, and I remember our professor Dalton was speaking, and he used to call himself trade absolutist, and which is why he obviously hated the Soviet Union. But from a nuanced perspective and from an impartial perspective, I would say the Soviet Union, the main reason why it didn't succeed economically is because it didn't because we have to understand that people are self-interested, and in the US, for example, if we see, like, even though the US economy is not perfect, there's obvious flaws. There's innovation, and one of the factors of the labor productivity, I think there's 8 factors. I don't recall all 8 of them, but I remember that labor productivity is that innovation is one of the factors of the average labor productivity, and innovation, and which comes in the form of technology. Russia didn't really have that much innovation. I mean, it did had like it did build nuclear weapons and such, but I would say the people weren't incentivized, and that's the main reason why economically the US was way better off even during the Cold War, which was post Stalin era. But I would say during the Stalin era, the economy of Russia, as Shazib was mentioning, it transformed from an agrarian to a industrialized economy. So basically, the 5-year plan. I think we talked about this in history class with Mr. Spivey. Basically, the 5-year plan was Stalin's plan for rapid urbanization, industrialization of Russia. And this 5-year plan started in, I believe, 1928. And under this plan, the steel production, if I'm not mistaken, nearly doubled. The coal production also like nearly doubled. And by the end of the 5-year plan, the USSR had become the second largest industrial producer in the world, only behind the United States. But once again, I would say this rapid economic growth was was not really efficient because of his because of the agricultural policies. I would say mainly because it was far more destructive. Stalin implemented a forced collective of agriculture, which meant that the farms were effectively state-controlled farms, which I believe are called kolkhozes. And basically, the problem with the state-controlled farm is that it won't incentivize the farmers to really produce more, because at the end of the day, if the farmer knows that he's going to produce like, let's say, like 1 ton of wheat in like a year, but the government is gonna take half of it and then gonna give it to other people, the farmer won't be like really interested in producing, because he knows that his crops are gonna get 50% of his crops are gonna get taken by the government anyways, and he's getting free food and stuff. So because of this, I would say, economically speaking, Russia or the Soviet Union had significant disadvantage. Like as Adam Smith stated, like you need land, labor, and capital. And even though Soviet Union had the land, labor, and capital, the labor factor was heavily skewed because the labor actually wasn't incentivized to produce more or to innovate more. So yeah, like overall, Stalin, like I would say like Stalin, his policies were somewhat effective because it transformed Russia into a industrialized nation. But once again, like it wasn't really effective because the people weren't incentivized. So yeah, that's from my part. And I also had a question for everyone. If you like, you can answer like drawing like parallels from the like basically like Soviet Union, they followed like a communist government principle, and like rest of the world followed, like the US, for example, a free market democratic principle. So would you say like in the long run, the communist market system is better than the free market system, or do you have any opinions regarding that?
I think that the free market system is better than the communist market system because Mrs. Spivey taught us, and it's also a very basic economic concept that very basic economic concept that in the free market prices rise and prices fall, and this gives signals to producers to produce more, produce less, based on consumer demand. While in the communist market, prices are all the same, and for this reason, producers don't know when to produce more or when to produce less, and for this reason, it creates a lot of economic inefficiencies. And for this reason, the free market is better. Yes, Mr. Arjun Mukherjee.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about the free market system being better. But I also wanted to add my learning about market inequalities or market failures, essentially, when free markets sort of fail because of an over allocation of resources or an under allocation of resources. So, for example, if producers are incentivized to produce demerit goods such as alcohol and cigarettes and stuff that are bad to the consumers, but since they're earning more profit, they produce them. It's an example of a market failure, and that's why I think that the overall best economic system would be a mix, of balance between two, where you see free market policies, but you also see government intervention when it's required and good government regulations.
Yes, Arif Malik.
Yeah, like I agree with Arjun, and I think even in Yale we were talking about state capitalism, I believe. So like yeah, like Arjun was saying about market inefficiency, and like I would say even in the free market, like let's say California for example. Like I believe it's about the factories. So the factories basically they had a lot of negative externalities because they were producing a lot of bad carbon dioxide and other gases which were harmful for the environment. But I believe the government, the Californian government actually had a thing called, if I'm not mistaken, the pollution tax or something. And basically in that, the the companies had to buy the permits in order to emit those gases. And as a result of this, the Californian government actually were able to sort of control the negative externality associated with the production of the gases that the factory produces. So I would agree with Arjun that free market capitalism, while it incentivizes buyers and sellers to produce more and go beyond the production possibilities curve, state capitalism is, I would say, the best option at the moment because it allows the government to step in when there's negative externalities. So I think Shazib has his hand raised. Shazib, would you agree with me, or do you have anything?
No, I'd say that I definitely agree with what you guys said. That there should be some government intervention when needed, as the government intervention would lead to like better and more advantageous benefits for the people. And so I'd basically just agree with whatever you guys said, and I definitely agree with the government intervention being there when necessary.
Thank you for all the opinions shared, and adding a little bit to Stalin's economic policies. And between 1918 and 1921, during the Russian Civil War, the Soviet government implemented war communism, which involved nationalizing industry and requisitioning grain from peasants. And the National Economic Policy (NEP), which was from 1921 to 1928, led by Lenin. The NEP allowed for some degree of private enterprise and market mechanisms, and Stalin inherited this policy but shifted away from it towards centralized control. And the first 5 year plan of Stalin, which was implemented between 1928 and 1932, focused on rapid industrialization and collectivization of agriculture, and it aimed to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into an industrial superpower. And there was also significant growth in heavy industries such as steel, coal, and machinery. And the Soviet Union saw an increase in industrial output and infrastructure development. And there were also a lot of challenges which emphasized on heavy industry, which often came at the expense of consumer goods and living standards. And there was also a lot of quality of products was sometimes poor, and production targets were frequently set realistically high. And the collectivization of agriculture aimed to conserve individual farm into large state-run collectives called kozots and state firms known as kozots. And however, this led to a widespread resistance from peasants, resulting in violent clashes and the destruction of livestock and crams. And the policy caused severe food shortages and famine, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine, which happened between 1932 and 1932, which resulted in millions of dead. And although the collectivization increased state control over agriculture and provided a source of grain for export in urban areas, it also caused long-term damage to agricultural productivity and rural life. And the second 5 year plan, which happened between 1933 and 1937, emphasized on heavy industry and infrastructure, and there was a lot of significant investments were made in sectors such as meteorology, energy, and transportation. And notable achievements include the development of new industrial centers, expansion of the railway network, and the growth in industrial production. And there was also continued neglect of consumer good and agriculture. Economic growth was often achieved through harsh methods and at the expense of worker welfare. And the third 5 year plan, which happened between 1938 and 1941, focused on accelerating industrialization and preparing the economy for potential military conflict. And the plan was interrupted by World War II, which shifted priorities to war production and defense. And despite the interruption, the industrial base established during the earlier 5 year plans provided crucial war equipment for the Soviet Union's war efforts. And the economic impact of World War II in Soviet Union, which was between 1941 and 1945, was obviously diverse. The Soviet economy was redirected to support the war effort, with significant increases in the production of tanks, aircrafts, and other military equipments. And the war also caused extensive damage to Soviet infrastructure and industrial facilities, particularly in Western countries. And post-war reconstruction were essential for economic recovery. And the post-war economic policies, which also included another 5 year plan, which happened between 1946 and 1950, focused on post-war reconstruction, rebuilding infrastructure, and revitalizing industry. And there's also rapid recovery of industrial output and infrastructure with a focus on heavy industry and defense. And despite improvements in industrial output, consumer goods and living standards remained relatively low compared to Western countries. And Stalin policies resulted in rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, transforming it into a major industrial power by the end of the 1930s. And the economic growth was often achieved through repressive means, including forced labor and political purges. While the Soviet Union made significant strides in industrial output, the human cost and inefficiency were high, and the legacy of forced collectivization and its impact on agriculture continued to affect Soviet economic performance and rural life for decades. And Stalin's economic policy had a profound and lasting impact on the Soviet Union, driving rapid economic growth but also causing significant social and economic disruptions. So this is a very brief economic analysis of Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union. Are there any more information or any opinions that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Malik, Arjun Mukherjee, or Mr. Shazib Karim? Yes, Arjun Mukherjee, I see you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I just want to add like an opinion about one of the few things like the Soviet Union did right, and I think that was really prioritizing the education of the top scientists that they had, and really trying to focus, especially like pre-World War II, focus on innovation of nuclear weapons, and also to discuss about the space race against the U.S. I think that's one of the biggest achievements that the Soviet Union made, was winning the space race against the U.S. and actually launching the first man-made spacecraft to space. So I think the Soviet Union had a lot of talent, but I think again one of the things that they didn't do right was actually utilizing that talent further, like the U.S. did, which again gave more incentives to innovate and to patent new technologies, whereas there was no incentive in the Soviet Union to patent new technologies because everything was state controlled, and there was no way to actually put your name down on the patent.
I'd say that Stalin's legacy is a complex one because I'd say that on one hand, he transformed the Soviet Union from a predominantly agrarian society into an industrial and military superpower, which played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II. However, this transformation came at an immense human cost, including millions of deaths from forced collectivization, famine, and political purges, and widespread repression. And Stalin's rule established a regime characterized by fear, oppression, and the stifling of personal freedoms, and the consequences of which continued to shape the Soviet Union and its successor states long after his death. And while his economic policies achieved rapid industrial growth, they also left a legacy of inefficiency, human suffering, and a rigid system that ultimately contributed to the Soviet Union's decline.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib and Arjun, and I would also say like property rights is, I believe, the term that should be used here, because at the end of the day, like Arjun's right, like the Soviet Union actually had a lot of talent. Like the first woman was a Soviet cosmonaut, Tereshkova. The first man to go to space was Yuri Gagarin. So like obviously the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in terms of technology, as which is manifested by the fact that they were able to first send a man and women to outer to space basically. And I would say ultimately the downfall was, this was the fact that the scientists in the US and the astronauts in the US and basically other researchers are actually well compensated for their actions, and they're incentivized to do more, and the stuff they produce is under their name. So basically they have patent the stuff that Arjun was saying. Uh they have a very specific property rights that is very clear to everyone. But in the Soviet Union, basically everything's under the government's name. So even though you might receive some credit, the like you like let's say like you discover the cure to cancer, but like in the US you would be basically celebrated everywhere, and like you would have the patent to it, and you would have the patent to it, and people would know that you're the one who did find a cure to cancer. But in the Soviet Union, if you find a cure to cancer, the government would declare it the government would declare that it had found a cure to cancer, and you were probably one of the helpers or researchers. So as a result of this, I would say the property rights is one of the main issues why the Soviet Union was not better off at the end, because they did have land, labor, and capital just like the US. But once again, the labor force weren't incentivized. And yeah, basically the fact that Arjun and Chazip summarized it very well.
So based on our discussion today, the conclusion that I think that we all can draw is that the Suharto's and Franco's rule in Indonesia and Spain respectively were economically were very advantageous for their respective countries, and they were very good. However, there were a lot of human rights allegation, and there were a lot of human rights violation. For example, in Indonesia, Suharto's case, he killed a lot of communist people, while in Franco's case, he was allied with the Nazis and the fascist Italy. And as for Stalin's case, in terms of economic rule, his one wasn't that his one wasn't good because he forced collectivization and he hindered economic growth, and because he supported communism, which at the end of the day prevents economic growth and it doesn't allow people to have a high standard of living. His economic impact on USSR was not very positive. And as for his human rights, it's not he was notorious for human rights violations, so that was also bad. So that's the conclusion that we can easily draw is that Suharto and Franco's rule for Indonesia and Spain respectively was good for the countries economically, while there were a lot of human rights violation, which we have to admit. While Stalin's rule economically, politically, or whatever you want to call it, was bad for USSR because he harmed a lot of people in the USSR. He caused a famine in the USSR, which is obviously bad. So his rule in the USSR was very bad. So that's a conclusion that I think that we all can draw and agree upon. Is that what is that what all of you agree with? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, and Mr. Arjun Mukherjee.
Yeah, I'd agree with that conclusion.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that as well.
Thank you for sharing your opinions. And again, that brings to the end of our discussion today, which was episode 7, Big Brothers and Economics, part 5, Suharto, Franco, and Stalin with Mr. Arjun Mukherjee. And this was the 5th episode of our series, Big Brothers and their Economics. And we choose the name Big Brothers because we don't want to sound very biased and use the name dictators. We chose to use the name Big Brothers, which basically means a person who has a lot of control, political and economic control over the country, and that's why we chose the name Big Brothers in order to sound a little bit less biased. And so the conclusion that we draw is that into this episode is that Suharto and Franco's rule in Indonesia and Spain, respectively, was good economically, but there were a lot of human rights violations. While Stalin's rule in USSR was bad economically and politically and every other way that can be imagined, because he created a famine and he killed a lot of people compared to the other two, which is obviously very bad. And so I would like to thank Mr. Arjun Mukherjee for coming into our episode today. Mr. Arjun Mukherjee, are there any final words that you would like to say before we leave?
Yeah, I'd just like to say I think this was a very constructive discussion on the economic policies and the political policies that were happening during the time period, the 20th century. And I think it's also important to highlight a lot of the different policies that occurred and a lot of the different economic growths and essentially like the pitfalls that a lot of these countries went through. So yeah, I think I enjoyed my stay in the podcast, and I think it was a good discussion. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Arjun Mukherjee, for sharing your insights, invaluable insights into this discussion. And again, thank you for the thank you to the audience for listening to our discussion for today, which was episode 17, Big Brothers and the Economics, part 5, Suharto, Franco, and Stalin with Mr. Arjun Mukherjee. Thank you to the audience again for listening to our discussion today, and we hope to see you next week with another very interesting episode topic and with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you for today, and thank you for listening to our episode, and we hope to see you next week. Goodbye for now.